Christmas Eve sounded sweet until I started working nights at Street Mercy Medical Center. In the operating wing, it was the worst shift of the year. Fluorescent light, bleach in the air, and a hallway jammed with carts. We were short again. My supervisor's steps snapped down the corridor like she was counting my mistakes. She pointed at the turnover schedule, at the rooms that still needed resetting, and at me, like my body was just another tool she could push harder. I pushed my cart into the first OR, and the cold bit through my gloves. Stainless steel trays sat under bright lamps like proof someone had been opened and stitched back together. I wiped, scrubbed, and disinfected until the chemical smell clung to my hair. The work is supposed to be precise, but on nights like this, precision becomes a prayer. You do what you can and keep moving. Around midnight, my phone vibrated in my pocket. I ignored it, but my mind still split in two. One half watching my hands clean, the other half picturing my apartment with the heat dead for 2 weeks. Cleveland winter doesn't ask if you can afford it. It presses in through window seams and old pipes. Our landlord kept giving me calm promises that were really warnings to stop calling. A part was ordered. A technician was coming. Soon. Meanwhile, Owen and I slept in hoodies. I boiled water for steam and called it warmth. While I wiped down surgical lights, I did math like it was faith. Rent, bus fare, groceries, the electric bill that spikes when you run a space heater. I had $43 left after bills this week. $43 to cover a holiday, a broken heater, and a kid who needed gloves that weren't full of holes. I chose milk over my own coat. I chose rice over better soap. I stretched everything until stretching felt like a private failure. Owen is 6, old enough to notice. He doesn't complain. He just gets quiet, like he's listening to the world and trying to decide if it's safe. He loves small traditions, the kind that don't cost much. Cocoa, a story, the idea that Christmas means something good. Before I left for work, I gave him that idea, the only way I knew how. I wrapped a cheap toy car in an old magazine page and told him Santa would find us anyway. The words came out steady, but inside I felt the sting. Hope is expensive when you are barely surviving, and sometimes you pay by pretending you believe first. The lie I told my son wasn't the Santa story, it was the safety story. I told him he would be safe with Mrs. Liu in the next unit while I worked. Mrs. Liu is elderly and gentle, the kind of neighbor who always smells like ginger and clean laundry. She had offered to watch him before, quietly, like she understood I was carrying too much. I took her offer because I had no backup plan, and because I wanted to believe protection could be as simple as a closed door and a warm lamp. All night, I cleaned like a ghost. I nodded when my supervisor glared. I pushed through the ache in my shoulders. I kept thinking about Owen's small hands and the way he leans into my side like he is checking that I am real. I promised myself I would get home, make cocoa, and let him fall asleep believing the world was kind. When my shift ended, the sky was dull gray, and the wind sliced my face the second I stepped outside. I hurried home with my head down, boots crunching salt and snow. Our building's front door stuck like it always did. The lobby smelled like wet coats and tired carpet. Upstairs, the hallway was too quiet. Mrs. Liu's door was shut, and there was no light under it. I looked at my phone and saw missed calls. My stomach dropped so hard it felt like falling. I knocked, then knocked again, harder, my knuckles burning. No answer. I tried to call her back and got nothing but silence. I rushed to my own door and pushed inside. The apartment was cold and darker than it should have been. Owen's boots were not by the mat. His jacket was still on the hook. The cookie plate I had left out was untouched, like time had paused in the middle of a promise. For a second I just stood there, trying to make the scene make sense. Then panic surged hot through my veins. My mind threw images at me I couldn't stop. The hallway behind me stopped being a hallway. It became a trap, a long, narrow tunnel full of doors I couldn't open fast enough. My hands shook as I dialed again and again, and every unanswered ring felt like a verdict. I didn't grab my coat. I didn't think. I just ran. I could hear my pulse louder than wind. Down the stairs, out the front door, into snow that cut my face and stole my breath. My heart hammered one thought into everything. I was already too late, and my feet carried me toward the Route 19 bus stop, the one nobody used, the one Owen had stared at before like it led somewhere important. I ran like my body could outrun reality. Snow stung my cheeks and melted into my eyelashes. The streetlights turned every flake into a needle, bright for a second, then gone. My lungs burned, and my boots slapped the sidewalk in a frantic rhythm that didn't match the distant carols drifting from downtown. Cleveland looked different when my child was missing. Familiar blocks bent into something hostile. Parked cars became hiding places. Dark porches became mouths. I kept scanning ahead, then behind, then up at windows like Owen might be waving from the wrong apartment. My mind offered that softer ending, and I crushed it with the truth. He was 6 and it was freezing. I didn't have gloves. I hadn't grabbed my coat. Panic had dressed me in a hoodie over thin hospital scrubs, and the wind found every weak spot. I hated myself for it. Like being unprepared was a sin that could reach out and hurt him. I tried Mrs. Leo again while I ran, thumb shaking so hard I almost dropped my phone. I checked my call history like it might change if I stared long enough. Missed calls. No voicemail. The silence was a wall I kept running into. 2 blocks over, the city was doing Christmas. Lights blinked on storefronts. Music drifted out of a bar when the door opened. People laughed under heat lamps like winter was a cute problem. I sprinted past and felt like I had stepped out of the world I belonged to. Those people were living in a version of December where kids were inside, not missing. I turned onto a quieter street, and the snow got deeper because nobody bothered to plow it. The sidewalks here were cracked and neglected, like the landlord who kept telling me soon. The air got emptier. My thoughts got louder. I started looking for signs the way I look for spills at work. Tiny clues. A child-sized footprint. A dropped mitten. The edge of a red hat in the wrong doorway. My brain kept replaying the last minute I saw him. Like if I rewound it enough, I could change it. I blamed my shift. I blamed the broken heat. I blamed myself for trusting that a quiet building meant a safe one for once tonight. That's when my brain, desperate for any pattern, reached for a name I'd heard in whispers. Caleb Knox. I didn't know Caleb Knox. I had never spoken to him. But his name lived in Cleveland like a shadow with edges. I'd heard it at street. Mercy. Not in official conversations, but in low-voiced exchanges people thought I couldn't hear. Orderlies would stop joking when a certain black SUV pulled up to the ER entrance. Security would straighten like they were suddenly being watched. Even cops had a way of pausing when that name drifted through the hallway. To me, Caleb Knox meant control. Money that didn't ask permission. Power that didn't need to shout. The kind of man you didn't bump into by accident. I hated that my mind went there, because it sounded like a myth people told to make the city feel organized. But fear doesn't care if something is a myth. Fear cares if it might be true. Ahead, the Route 19 stop sat where it always had, like a leftover thought. Nobody used it anymore. Not really. The city rerouted lines years ago, and the shelter became a plastic box full of flyers and old stickers. But Owen knew it. He knew every step of my route home from the hospital because riding together, even on a bus, was our small tradition. It was the part of Christmas that felt like ours. As I ran, I could see his reasoning like a map. Mrs. Liu had probably tried to keep him inside. Owen would have listened politely, then felt that stubborn, hopeful pull that lives in kids. He would have thought meeting me would help. He would have believed he was doing something loving, not dangerous. And beneath that, I could feel the other hurt he carried, the one I pretended not to see. He had been disappointed before, not because he was spoiled, but because sometimes magic skips families like ours. I remembered his face when he talked about Santa forgetting us again, and my stomach clenched because it wasn't really about Santa. It was about broken heat, empty cupboards, and me telling him to keep believing anyway. I reached the corner and finally got a clear view of the stop. The shelter was a dim shape under a streetlight, half buried in drifting snow. The bench looked wet and lonely. For one heartbeat, I expected to see Owen's small outline there, proud and shivering. Instead, I saw a black luxury car idling near the curb, engine running, windows dark. It didn't belong on this forgotten street. It was too clean, too expensive, too deliberate. My feet slowed for half a second. Then fear sharpened into something new. Owen wasn't alone, and whoever was here had chosen this place on purpose. The Route 19 stop came into view like a bruise on the street. No lights, no people. Just a glass shelter half buried in wind-blown snow, and a black luxury car idling beside it. My legs went weak for a split second, then panic shoved me forward. The car looked wrong here. Too clean, too expensive, its dark windows reflecting the streetlight like they could hide anything. Then I saw him. Owen stood near the open rear door, shoulders up, hat crooked, cheeks red in that dangerous way. His mittens were stiff with ice. He rubbed his hands together, but it was clumsy, like his fingers didn't want to bend. A man waited a few steps away, tall, still, calm in a way that didn't belong on a frozen corner at night. I didn't know him, but I knew the name my city whispered when it wanted people to stop looking too closely. Caleb Knox. Every rumor rushed through me at once. Stranger, car, control. The version of the world where my child disappears. I didn't walk. I charged. I called Owen's name and the wind stole half of it. He turned fast, relief flashing across his face before guilt crowded it out. I grabbed him by the shoulders and pulled him into me so hard we both stumbled. His coat was thin, and the cold had gone straight through it. I pressed my hands to his back, then his cheeks, then the warm spot under his jaw, checking him like I could undo the last hour with my palms. His skin was too cold. His breath came tight. His body trembled against mine with a stubborn little shiver that said he'd been out here too long. My instincts roared at me to get him away. Away from the car, away from the man, away from anything that smelled like power. But the street answered back with silence. No bus headlights, no rumble, no brakes, just wind scraping over frozen asphalt and a faint wash of holiday music from somewhere warmer. Owen had come because Route 19 was our thing. After my shift, we rode home together, our small tradition that made him feel safe. Tonight, he must have decided to meet me like a gift, like the brave kind of love only kids have. He hadn't been reckless. He'd been loving. And then the obvious landed. Heavy. Holiday service. Storm. This bus was not coming. He'd been waiting for a promise that didn't exist. On a bench that would steal heat faster than a child could make it. I could almost feel the moment his hope snapped, the tired belief that even Santa forgot our building again. Not as drama. As disappointment he'd earned. I forced myself to look at Caleb Knox. He wasn't touching Owen. He wasn't blocking the door. He wasn't trying to pull me into a conversation. He stood with his hands visible, posture relaxed, eyes tracking Owen's shaking shoulders more than my face. He looked like a man who had already done the math and didn't need permission to act on it. I expected him to crowd me, to demand something, to make me feel small. Instead, when I yanked Owen closer, Caleb stepped back. He made it clear, with flat certainty, that the situation was simple. No bus, weather getting worse. A kid too small to wait in the cold. The car was warm. That was the only practical option he'd seen, and he'd held it open. No saving speech, no threat, no insistence that I owe him. The warm air from the car brushed my back, and it felt wrong. Like accepting heat from a man like that meant accepting the rest of him too. My whole life had taught me that warmth from powerful men always had a price, but Owen's shivering didn't care about my pride. I hugged him tighter, pressing my mouth to his hat so my breath could reach him. Anger swelled until it burned. I was angry at the world for making my child pay for adult failures. Angry at myself for believing my lie that he would be safe just because I needed him to be. Angry at Caleb Knox for being right in a way that didn't feel kind, only necessary. Snow kept falling. Owen's shaking eased a little against my chest, but his fingers were still stiff, and my own hands started to shake as the cold finally caught me. I stared at the dead bus stop, then at the open car door, then down at Owen's watery eyes. I couldn't sort this into good guy or bad guy. I only knew my son was cold, the storm was building, and I had seconds right now to choose what kind of risk I could live with. The wind shoved at us like it had hands. I felt it through my coat and in my lungs every time I tried to breathe. Owen was pressed against my chest, his backpack thumping my ribs. Behind us, the Route 19 stop sat in the dark, and the black luxury car kept idling, patient, as if it could afford the night. We could not. There was no bus, and the snow was thickening into the kind that turns streets into traps. My son was warm because of a stranger's car, and that fact made my skin crawl. Caleb Knox walked a few paces behind, not close enough to be comforting, not far enough to pretend he was not involved. He moved like someone used to being obeyed without raising his voice. No hurry, no show. Just calm, watchful stillness that kept my pulse high. I kept my body angled so Owen stayed on the inside, tucked behind my shoulder, like my bones could block whatever Caleb Knox really was. 2 blocks over, Christmas lights and music belonged to other people. Then we turned onto my street, and the contrast got cruel. My building hunched at the curb. The entry light flickered. The sidewalk was cracked and slick, half cleared in narrow paths where tenants had carved their own survival lines. The lobby door did not seal right, so the whole place breathed cold, a draft that slid under my jeans and climbed my spine. And there it was, the picture I never wanted. A black Mercedes beside a struggling apartment block. Owen's small hands gripping his backpack straps. Me, hair stiff with ice, scrub pants showing under my coat. Mrs. Liu appeared in the doorway, bundled in a quilted robe and a knit hat. Her face was tight with worry. She hurried toward us and reached for Owen first, because that is what good neighbors do. I let her touch his shoulder, let her confirm he was real. Her gaze flicked to the car, to Caleb, and I could feel her mind trying to place him into a story that made sense. I stayed between Owen and Caleb anyway. My whole body turned into a wall. I cataloged details the way I do at work when I clean an operating room that still feels hot with urgency. Caleb kept his hands visible. He did not step into my space. He watched, not to charm anyone, but like he did not need witnesses to prove he was in control. In my head, I demanded answers until my jaw hurt. Why was he at that forgotten stop? Why had my child been near his door? What did he want from a woman who could not even get her landlord to answer a call? The fear in me kept searching for the hook. The moment help turns into a debt. What I got instead was a plain reality that made sense. He had seen a child alone in weather that could turn dangerous fast. He had known the buses were not running. He had used the only heat available and waited, holding the situation steady, until an adult showed up. It did not make him safe. It made the moment complicated. My anger still flared, because anger was the only thing keeping my knees from buckling. I pulled Owen closer, rubbed his arms, checked his fingers again, watched his cheeks brighten as the cold tried to take him back. "Mrs. Liu fussed, and I let her, because pride was not worth my son's skin. Caleb's gaze lifted past us to the building. I saw the second he noticed the draft, the thin door, the way Owen's breath fogged inside the lobby like we were still outside. His eyes narrowed, not in disgust, but in assessment. Then he offered something that landed like a threat wrapped in generosity. He could get the heat fixed, not eventually. Not when my landlord felt like pretending to care. Fixed, like reality could bend because he asked. My throat tightened. I had lived long enough to know nothing comes free, especially not from men with that kind of reach. Free is how you wake up one day and realize you have been bought in small pieces. I forced a tight kind of gratitude into my face, the kind you give strangers so they will leave. Then I turned my key, ushered Owen and Mrs. Liu inside, and pulled the door shut with shaking hands. Through the metal and the draft, I could still feel Caleb Knox out there, steady as a parked shadow, and I understood the new fear I was carrying into my apartment. Not just losing Owen, but owing the wrong man when the heat suddenly came back on. I braced for silence and the radiator answered. Inside my apartment, everything smelled like wet winter. Owen's boots dripped onto the peeling linoleum. My hands still shook as I twisted the faucet, repeating the only truth that mattered. He is here, he is breathing, he is safe. I did what moms do when we don't have money for emergencies. I peeled off his damp layers, rubbed his arms until my palms warmed him, and pressed a washcloth soaked in warm tap water against his fingers and cheeks. I wrapped him in the thick blanket we owned, the one I'd been using as a curtain over the drafty window. I put a pot on the stove with the last of my chicken broth and whatever noodles were left, because warm liquid is the closest thing to comfort I could guarantee. Relief didn't feel soft. It came in jagged flashes, like my body didn't trust good news. As soon as Owen settled on the couch, my panic drained into shame. I kept seeing the lie I had told before my shift, the one I told because I needed my hours and he needed supervision. I had convinced myself Mrs. Liu meant safety. I had convinced Owen too, and then I had come home to silence. I checked his skin for cold spots, watched his chest rise and fall, listened for a cough that would mean the night had taken something from him. He leaned into the blanket, eyes heavy, trusting me in the way only a child can. That trust hurt worse than the fear. The apartment was still freezing, not just chilly, but the kind of cold that lives in the walls and the metal of the sink. Our radiators had been dead for 2 weeks. The landlord's promises had turned into a routine, an excuse, a vague tomorrow, then nothing. I had called from my break at the hospital, filed complaints, left notes. I got ignored so consistently I started to believe it was normal. Then a click came from the radiator under the living room window. Small, mechanical. A second later the vents sighed, and a thin breath of warm air slid into the room. For a heartbeat, my brain refused it. I stood there holding the washcloth, waiting for the warmth to die like a prank. But it didn't. The metal began to tick as it heated. The stale cold that had been sitting on my furniture started to lift. Even the wet coats by the door changed smell as they warmed, like steam waking up hidden fabric. Warmth should have felt like comfort. In my stomach it felt like debt, because it matched what Caleb Knox had implied outside. Not in a hopeful way, in a practical, immediate way, as if he had looked at my building, made one call, and decided neglect didn't get to win tonight. The hallway answered before I could. Footsteps rushed. Doors opened. Someone's surprised shout echoed through the thin walls. A moment later, Mrs. Liu's careful knocking tapped against my door, and her voice carried disbelief and relief, the way neighbors sound when something impossible happens in a place that usually gets forgotten. I didn't open up right away. I just listened, and the anger rose hot and clean. Months of begging had earned me nothing. One winter night with a black car at the curb, and suddenly the heat worked. It wasn't maintenance. It was pressure. It was power applied to the right throat. My phone buzzed on the counter, and my heart jumped like it wanted to run again. The screen showed a missed call from an unknown number. No voicemail. Then a text notification appeared, unopened, like a door left slightly ajar. I didn't tap it. I couldn't. Thanking him felt like an invitation. Rejecting it felt like a challenge. Staying silent felt like weakness. Every option tasted like a string tightening. Across the room, Owen's shoulders unclenched as the warmth spread. His face softened. For the first time in weeks, his body stopped bracing against the cold. Watching that, my pride crumbled in quiet pieces. I would endure almost any humiliation for his comfort, and that was exactly why Caleb's help was dangerous. I imagined my landlord's phone ringing, his voice changing when a man like Caleb spoke. I imagined eviction notices. Owen blinked toward the radiator like it was magic. I couldn't let him learn magic has hooks. Another knock sounded, firmer this time, and I felt the night lean closer to my door. Mrs. Liu's hallway light made everything feel public. Her door was cracked open, cardigan pulled tight, worried eyes on me. Owen stood beside me wrapped in our blanket, cheeks still pink from the radiator heat that had been dead for weeks now. He kept looking toward the stairwell like he expected the black car to appear again. This building loved rumors the way it loved cold drafts. I could feel neighbors listening through thin walls. Owen wanted to thank Caleb Knox, and Mrs. Liu's presence made the doorway feel like a stage. I was too exhausted to refuse without turning it into a scene, so I made rules in my head and held them like a shield. Caleb could step inside for coffee, nothing else. He stayed where I could see his hands. He did not move past the folding table. Owen stayed with me, never out of sight. If anything felt wrong, I ended it. When Caleb crossed the threshold, the air tightened. His coat carried a clean, expensive scent that did not belong in our stairwell. Snow clung to his shoulders, and he paused just long enough to map the room and its exits. I hated how easy it was for him. My apartment is tiny, but I keep it clean because it is the only thing I control. The couch sags, lifted by an old towel folded underneath. The table wobbles unless you wedge cardboard under one leg. Paper snowflakes Owen made at school hang over the window. The radiator hissed. Damp coats steamed near the door, and the room held sound close, every breath too loud. Caleb did not roam. He did not touch the framed photo of Owen and me at the zoo. He did not drift toward my bedroom. He stood where I indicated, shoulders relaxed, eyes steady, like he understood that respect was not a favor, it was the entry fee. Coffee became my boundary because it was the only hospitality I could afford without surrendering. I poured it into mismatched mugs, one with a chipped rim, one with a faded hospital logo from a donation shelf. The heat of the ceramic warmed my palms and steadied my hands. Owen hovered close to Caleb, vibrating with gratitude, fingers twisting the strap of his backpack. That backpack hit me like a bruise. It was the same one he wore the day his birthday cake melted on the bus because I picked up an extra cleaning shift and our ride home took too long. I remembered his smile while he pretended it did not matter. Tonight I saw the same courage in his shoulders, the way he tried to be good so I would not feel guilty. Caleb watched Owen with a stillness that felt trained, like someone who learned early to keep emotion behind his teeth. In careful fragments I drew out, I understood he had been expected at a holiday party with people who feared him and called it loyalty. Instead, he was here, choosing quiet over celebration. He had no family waiting up for him. There had been a fire years ago that erased his past, and he rebuilt himself into something untouchable by controlling what he could and avoiding what hurt. Hearing that, my anger shifted. It moved off him and onto the system that had taught me the same lesson, just cheaper. I cleaned operating rooms at night because it paid more and the benefits mattered. Owen's father was gone, and I had learned to calculate safety versus dignity like it was my second job. I stretched groceries, chose heat over a coat, and told my son a Santa story I did not fully believe because hope is expensive when you are barely surviving. I tried to close the visit cleanly. Inside my chest, my gratitude stayed tight, like a bandage I did not trust. Caleb made no move to push past my ending, yet he lingered a heartbeat longer than necessary, not predatory, just reluctant. like leaving meant returning to a place even colder than mine. That loneliness scared me more than his power, because power I could brace for. Human hunger was harder. When he finally stepped back into the hallway, Owen's eyes followed him like a promise being made without my consent. I felt it settle in my stomach. This was not going to stay a one-night story. Owen had already latched on, and I was already afraid of what it would cost to pull him free. I woke up on Christmas morning to a sound I hadn't heard in weeks, the radiator clicking, then breathing warm air into our apartment. The cold edge in the room was gone. Owen was sprawled across his pillow, cheeks soft, body loose, and for one dangerous second I let myself believe we'd been handed a normal miracle. Then I remembered where that miracle came from, and my stomach tightened. Mrs. Liu drifted past our door twice, her worry disguised as errands. I tried to keep my day small. Cartoons for Owen, leftovers stretched into lunch, my mind sweeping for threats the way I scrubbed for germs at Street Mercy. I kept waiting for the price to show up. Caleb Knox showed up instead. Not in the dark this time. In daylight, like he had the right to be seen here. His black car idled at the curb, glossy against dirty snow, and the air around my door filled with attention I didn't ask for. Caleb carried a paper bag and a box like they were extras from some other life. Not charity, not a grand gesture. My brain still translated it as leverage. Men like him didn't do repeated kindness without collecting interest later. Still, he stayed at the threshold, hands visible, giving me every chance to refuse without a scene. The respect made it harder. Owen's excitement hit the room before the coffee smell did. He had been asking since breakfast if the man from the car would come back. He drew pictures of a shiny seat and a tiny cup next to a stick figure version of me holding his hand. It was a child building a map to safety with crayons. And it scared me, because attachment is a handle the world can grab. Caleb didn't feed that attachment. He didn't ask Owen to call him anything. He didn't touch him like he owned him. He acknowledged him the way you acknowledge someone important, and that was its own kind of power. Owen glowed anyway. I watched my son make space for Caleb in his idea of family, and I wanted to slam a door on it before it grew roots. 2 days later, Caleb came back again, at a time that felt accidental on purpose. Another bag, another practical excuse that could pass as convenience instead of charity. Mrs. Liu watched from her peephole like a guard. Neighbors whispered in the stairwell. I could feel labels forming. Owen started lining his drawings on the windowsill, as if he could summon Caleb back with prayers. And the building changed. The stairlight that had been dead for months flickered on and stayed on. The lobby draft eased because someone sealed the gap under the front door. Our landlord, who had ignored me like I was static, suddenly returned calls and posted a maintenance notice like he'd been competent all along. I didn't have to be told what happened. I could taste it. Pressure. The part that made my skin prickle came from Owen's backpack. A folded paper from school slid out, and I saw the balance line stamped paid. Owen's lunch account, the one I'd been juggling with my next paycheck, had been handled without my consent. Just a problem erased. I sat on the couch while Owen played and felt anger rise so hot, it almost matched the radiator. I hated how relieved I was. I hated that a man's influence could fix what my labor couldn't. I hated the way help could become ownership without ever asking permission. In my head, I rehearsed my boundary like a prayer. Assistance was not a claim. Warmth was not a chain. My son was not collateral. Caleb's boundaries stayed clean. He never pushed past my threshold. He never asked personal questions that weren't necessary. He never acted like he had bought access. And that was the worst part, because his actions still created gravity. He didn't have to demand anything for my world to start orbiting him. After each visit, I listened to the radiators ticking and watched Owen sleep. I felt cautious hope, trying to push through my ribs, and I crushed it with suspicion. Hope was expensive. Hope was how you ended up owing the wrong people. On the 7th night after Christmas, Caleb came when the building was quiet, and the streetlights made the snow look bruised. He didn't bring bags. He brought a different energy, tighter, alert. I saw it in the way he scanned the stairwell, and in the way his car stayed running. Something in his world was moving toward mine, and I could feel the collision coming. That was the night Mrs. Liu's phone went unanswered, and I realized my next shift might leave Owen with no one safe to turn to. The call came while I was rubbing lotion into Owen's dry winter hands, trying to make bedtime feel normal. Street Mercy needed me in an hour. A late case, a spill in an operating room, not enough staff. The message hit like a threat because I knew the policy. Miss too much and your name stops showing up. Rent was due in 3 days. Overtime was the rope keeping us from falling. I went straight to Mrs. Liu's door with my keys already out, ready to hand Owen over like always. I knocked. Nothing. I knocked again and listened to the building's draft whistling through the hallway cracks. I called her phone and heard it ring into silence. No TV, no kettle, no shuffle behind her door. The quiet made my thoughts sprint. Sick. Asleep. Away. Anything that meant my safety net was gone. Back inside, I did panic math with shaking hands. I could not take Owen to the hospital. I could not leave him alone. I could not lose my job. The clock kept chewing through my choices. Then the stairwell door downstairs opened. Slow and deliberate. I checked the peephole and saw Caleb Knox in the hallway. Coat crisp, face calm, a small bag in one hand like he had a harmless reason to be here. My anger flashed first, because his timing felt cruel. Then my throat tightened with the truth. He was the only adult within reach. Letting him in was not romance. It was triage. I set rules as fast as my body moved. Owen stayed in my line of sight. Caleb stayed in the living room. Doors stayed locked. No bedrooms. No wandering. I wrote my number and Mrs. Liu's on a torn page and set it on the table like a boundary in ink. I laid out Owen's inhaler and pajamas and kept my shoulders squared between Caleb and my son while I explained our routine in clipped, exhausted sentences. Caleb did not act offended. He listened like my details mattered. He glanced at the lock, the chain, the window latch, the way a person checks weather. He asked practical things without pushing. Bedtime. Allergies. What calms Owen down if he wakes up scared? Who to call if something feels wrong? No charm, no speeches, no pretending we were anything but strangers making a hard choice. Owen was half asleep and suddenly bright, thrilled by the idea of thanking the man with the warm car. He hovered near me, then offered Caleb his trust like it was easy. Relief and jealousy hit me together. Relief that Owen was not afraid. Jealousy that he could still believe adults always come back. I hugged him tight, forced my face calm, and walked out of my apartment like I was leaving a fragile piece of my heart on the couch. The hospital swallowed me on contact. Antiseptic sting, fluorescent hum, empty corridors that made every distant beep sound louder. I scrubbed and wiped until my knuckles burned, but my mind kept running home. I checked my phone between tasks, then hated myself for checking, then checked again. I kept picturing Owen waking up, calling for me, and a stranger misunderstanding what a scared child needs. A little after 2 a.m, the lights flickered. Somewhere a monitor sped up, then steadied. My phone showed missed calls and my blood turned to ice. I ducked into a supply closet with my gloves still on, breath fogging my mask, and I was already imagining police lights outside my building when a message came through. Not words I can repeat, just the meaning. Owen had woken from a nightmare. Caleb had stayed calm. He had checked the peephole when footsteps passed our door, then moved himself between the lock and my child until the hallway went quiet again. That was the twist in my stomach. Even in my tiny living room, his world had rules about danger. I finished my shift with my nerves peeled raw and ran home through gray pre-dawn snow. When I unlocked my door, warm air met my face. Owen was asleep on the couch, blanket tucked high, cheeks soft with real comfort. Caleb sat in the chair by the window, still awake, still placed between my son and the door like he had stood guard all night. Relief hit so hard my knees went weak. Gratitude followed, sharp enough to scare me, because this was not babysitting anymore. On the table sat my handwritten rules, untouched, and that scared me more than broken ones. He had respected them. Now I had to decide how to keep them tomorrow. Morning looked harmless through the cheap blinds. Winter sun laid stripes across the linoleum, and the radiator that had been dead for weeks kept up a steady hum now, like the apartment remembered how to breathe. I stood at the counter in my scrub pants, stirring instant oatmeal until it turned gluey. Owen padded out in socks, hair flattened on one side, and the sight of him upright and whole loosened something in my chest. My body was wrecked from the hospital shift, but my nerves still buzzed under my skin. Relief came in waves, and each wave carried a question underneath it. Caleb Knox was still here. He sat at the far end of the couch, coat folded beside him, hands on his knees, stillness wrapped around him like a rule. He looked controlled in that calm, expensive way, but his eyes were a shade too tired, like he'd spent the night listening instead of sleeping. I tried to stay practical. Owen was safe. That should have been enough. But I'd begged our landlord about the heat until my throat hurt and nothing changed. Caleb appeared once and the radiators woke up. Caleb stayed one night and my son made it to morning without me. My mind stacked those facts like evidence while my hands shook from exhaustion. Owen didn't stack evidence. He ate his oatmeal and bounced on his heels like this was a holiday miracle instead of a complicated mess. He kept glancing at Caleb the way kids look at something they've decided is theirs. Then, With the careless honesty of a child, he used a family word for Caleb, a dad-coded label kids borrow from classrooms and cartoons when they want to make sense of a grown man in their space. Owen said it like it was simple. For me, it landed like a stone in my stomach. Fear hit first, sharp and animal, because Owen's heart was reaching faster than my consent could keep up. Tenderness hit right after, because his face was bright, and I hated the world for making that brightness so fragile. I watched Caleb when it happened. He didn't correct Owen. He didn't encourage it either. His attention flicked to me, quick and unreadable, like he was waiting to see what boundary I would draw, while Owen wandered to the window to press his hands against the warm glass and watch snow drift past the parking lot. I replayed the night like a report. Owen woke scared, and Caleb stayed steady. He checked the peephole when footsteps moved in the hallway. He positioned himself so the door was never between him and my child. At some point, he made a quiet call, efficient, like help could appear because he decided it should. That was the part that scared me. Not the gentleness, but the competence underneath it. The way danger lived inside his calm like a second heartbeat. I started drafting rules in my head the way I count dollars at the grocery store. Clear, tight, no room for fantasy. Caleb could be a man who helped in a storm. He could be someone Owen thanked, but he could not become a promise I couldn't guarantee. No school contact lists, no events, no slide into a role Owen would depend on. Then the guilt changed shape, and I realized it wasn't only about Owen. It was about me noticing how the room felt with Caleb in it, the quiet steadiness, the sense that if something went wrong, someone else might hear it before I did. I hated that my body responded to that feeling like it was water after a long drought. I hated, too, the quiet part of me that enjoyed not being alone for one night. I scraped the empty plate into the sink and let the radiator's hum fill the space between us. Pretending last night was a one-time favor would not protect my child. It would only leave the rules unspoken and the expectations loose. I needed to talk about names, about what Owen could call Caleb, and what Caleb was and was not to us. I looked at Owen in the morning light, and then at Caleb, watchful on my couch. Gratitude rose, and it almost felt like panic. So I chose the only thing I could control. I decided we were going to have the boundary conversation now, in daylight, and Caleb would either accept my rules or reveal the kind of man who doesn't negotiate. Early afternoon winter sun made the school parking lot look almost clean, even though slush still clung to the curb. I came straight from Street Mercy in worn scrubs under my coat. Inside, the hallway smelled like crayons and disinfectant. I told myself I was here because Owen mattered. The truer reason was fear. Fear that if I missed one more thing, my son would stop believing I would show up. I signed in with a pen chained to the counter and tried not to look like a woman who had worked all night. Other parents looked rested and sure. I kept my shoulders high anyway, pretending I belonged. Pride is what I wear when I cannot afford softness, and shame is what follows behind me like a wet footprint in every hallway today. Owen's classroom door was covered in paper snowflakes. He spotted me and ran, backpack bouncing, face bright with the kind of hope that hurts to carry. Then Caleb Knox appeared behind me. He moved like someone trained to read rooms and exits, calm and careful with his space. His coat looked expensive in a way that made my own feel thin, but he kept his posture small, gaze lowered as people passed. I had allowed him to come under rules I repeated in my head like a prayer. Public place. Owen stays within sight. No paperwork. No names that could follow us home. I told myself it was control. It was also Owen asking with such careful excitement that I couldn't take another bright thing from him. Owen lit up when he saw Caleb too. That was the first warning. My child's trust moved faster than my consent could keep up. His teacher stepped into the hall with a folder and a steady smile. She looked from Owen to me, then to Caleb, and her face softened in that automatic way people do when they think they recognize a family. She referred to Caleb as Owen's dad. The word landed like a punch to the sternum. Heat rushed up my neck, anger and panic braided together. My first instinct was to correct her, to protect the truth the way I protect Owen from hot stoves and strangers. The next instinct was worse, to swallow it, because the hallway was full of ears and Owen was full of wanting. Owen stood taller. His shoulders lifted like the word had placed something warm inside his ribs. He leaned closer to Caleb, not frightened at all, and his smile turned steady, proud, normal. For a second, I saw the life he wanted. A simple story. I made a choice in the space of one breath. I did not correct the teacher. That was not me being passive. That was me measuring damage. If I corrected her, Owen would hear rejection, right there under fluorescent lights, with other parents watching. If I stayed silent, I could keep his face bright for one more minute and deal with the consequences later, in private. The teacher spoke about routines and progress and keeping Owen focused. I nodded while my mind sprinted. Dad meant forms and emergency contacts. Dad meant pickup permissions and school security. Dad meant a name in a system, a connection that could be traced. I watched Caleb while she talked. He did not step closer when he was called that. He did not correct it either. He held still, eyes on Owen, and something about his restraint made my stomach twist. He was not claiming. He was not performing. He was simply present. When Owen went back inside, my pulse thudded in my fingertips. I didn't need to speak out loud to confront Caleb. The confrontation lived in my chest, sharp and clear. If he was going to be dad-coded in public spaces, then I needed terms that protected my child, not a storyline that fed him. I needed to know what happens when the school calls the emergency number and a man like Caleb answers. I needed to know if his real name could sit on a clipboard without dragging his world into ours. I needed to know if he could show up consistently, or if consistency was a privilege he had never had to earn. Caleb met my eyes, and I could feel him understanding the shape of my fear without me giving him a script. He didn't push. He didn't claim ownership. He accepted the boundary I hadn't even spoken yet, and that should have made me feel safe. Instead, it made me realize I was already relying on him. That reliance felt like love's shadow, long before love itself, and it terrified me. Because the moment the world decided Caleb was Owen's dad, Caleb became visible. And in Caleb's world, visibility always has a price. Night makes my apartment feel smaller. The heater clicks on and off. Owen is asleep behind his door. I'm on the couch with my phone, too awake to pretend this is over. I've been calling Caleb Knox help, a favor. After the school hallway, I can't hide behind that word. I let the outside world label him for Owen because my son's face mattered more than my pride. Now Owen is attaching to a man I cannot explain, and I'm the one who promised him safety while I was lying. The truth doesn't arrive as a confession. It arrives as proof. It starts with his last name. I search Knox and find a clean business article. Redevelopment projects, job creation, community partners. There's a photo of him cutting a ribbon beside a politician, and he looks the same as he looked in my doorway, calm, controlled, unreadable. Then I find a foundation page and a courthouse docket. His name sits on a charity board list. His companies sit in civil filings. Different titles, different logos, the same addresses. Everything is layered, shells inside shells, built to keep the man at the center untouched. And then the building does what buildings always do. It talks. Mrs. Liu stops me in the hallway with that protective look she saves for danger. She doesn't lecture me. She gives me a warning shaped like concern. She has heard the whispers for years. Caleb Knox isn't known because he's loud. He's known because when his name shows up, problems disappear. Landlords answer. Lights get fixed. Calls get returned. That's when I understand what my body already knew at the bus stop. Caleb isn't only wealthy. He is leverage. He has legitimate fronts, real estate, logistics, private security, consulting things that look normal on paper. Underneath, there is a network you can feel without seeing. Favors collected, pressure applied, consequences delivered quietly. The sick part is that knowing this makes me want to run, and makes me breathe easier. My anger hits late. Not because danger exists. My anger is because he let Owen get close without telling me what he really was. He let me invite him into my home. He let a teacher assume he was Owen's dad in public, and he kept the truth wrapped in silence. I needed the choice. And then the worst twist settles in, because it makes everything fit. I don't think Caleb found us at the Route 19 stop by chance. I think he identified us. There were details I tried to dismiss. The way he positioned his body between Owen and the street. The way his eyes checked corners before they ever settled on me. The way his car wasn't just warmth. It was a barrier. The way he reacted to footsteps in the hall like they carried information. I go back to that first night and remember my phone. Missed calls before I even knew Owen was gone. I pull up the log again and notice one number that called twice and never left anything. When I search it, there's nothing. No name. No carrier detail that looks right. It feels like a burner, like a hand that wanted to reach me without being seen. A cold thought slides under my ribs. What if Owen wasn't only lost but noticed? What if someone saw a small boy waiting and decided a child is easy currency? What if Caleb stepped in because he recognized that pattern from his world and chose to intercept it before it reached my door? That does not make him safe. It makes him deliberate. And deliberate power can shield you or cage you depending on the day. So I set conditions in my head like I'm writing them down. If Caleb stays in our orbit, I need honesty, not half-truths. Owen doesn't get promises he can't keep. Owen doesn't get a name that will break him if it disappears. Caleb doesn't put my address on anything official. He doesn't pay for things that bind me. He doesn't do anything in my name. The heater clicks again. The room warms. Owen sighs in his sleep, safe for this 1 hour, and I hate that safety still feels borrowed. Then my phone buzzes. A message from an unknown number with a photo preview I don't open. I don't have to. I can see enough. Owen's school entrance in daylight, my coat, his small backpack. Truth doesn't free me. It just makes the ground shift under my feet. Early winter light slid across my cramped kitchen like it was trying to be gentle with me. The coffee maker sputtered, then steadied, breathing out a smell that made my throat ache. A small pile of cheap Christmas Eve wrapping paper still sat on the counter, proof that we had tried. Owen's tiny socks lay near the heater vent, toes aimed toward warmth like they knew where safety lived. I stood barefoot on cold linoleum and realized calm still felt unfamiliar, like a room I didn't know how to stand in without flinching. Knowing who Caleb Knox was rewired my senses. The hallway outside our door stopped being just a hallway. It became a question. Every footstep sounded like someone choosing a direction for us. Every car that slowed outside made my stomach drop before my eyes could focus. My phone buzzing felt like a hand on the back of my neck. I hated that vigilance had become my morning routine. The threat made itself real in the cleanest, cruelest way. A plain white paper slid under my door while I rinsed a pot. No handwriting, no curse words, just typed lines, neat and calm. It used Owen's full name and his teacher's name, like someone had copied it from a form. It listed our building address and the day rent was due, like it was offering friendly reminders. It ended with politeness that made my skin crawl. I read it until the words blurred, because my brain kept refusing the truth. We had been seen. I didn't call the police. I had lived long enough to know what happens when you bring a slow system to a fast threat. I took a photo, saved it, then sent it to Caleb, because at that point I understood another truth. The same world that ignored my broken heat was not going to protect my child from someone who could reach our door with paper and confidence. Caleb did not arrive with rage or romance. He arrived with systems. Within an hour, the hallway camera that had been dead for years blinked back to life. The landlord who had dodged my calls suddenly left voicemails promising new locks and lighting. Owen's school called to confirm emergency contacts, because someone had tried to change them using details that should not have been public. That was the moment my knees went weak. Whoever was circling us could reach into our life without breaking a window. Caleb stood near my doorway like he was giving me air on purpose. He angled himself toward the hall, attention tracking exits the way my eyes tracked Owen. He asked for times, names, and camera angles. He turned my fear into a list. He turned my panic into something that could be proven. Then the expectation reversal hit, and it made me sick. The pressure wasn't coming from a faceless street enemy. It was tied to legitimacy. A local developer who sponsored school events and posed for photos beside giant checks. The kind of man people called community-minded while he collected favors behind closed doors. The kind of man who knew how to threaten without raising his voice. I didn't need a full dossier to recognize the pattern. Power in America wears a clean shirt. That was why Caleb's response was surgical. Loudness would only make us a story. He didn't want us to be a story. He wanted us to be uninteresting again. Watching him work was terrifying, because it wasn't chaos. It was consequence. He gathered documentation, pulled records, and applied pressure where clean people hate it most. Banks, boards, contracts, reputations. Meetings appeared. Lawyers appeared. The developer's confidence started to cost him. In the middle of all that, I hit my own turning point. I realized I had been letting Caleb get close to Owen on exhausted consent. Not forced, not manipulated with words. Just the kind you give when you are tired, grateful, and desperate for relief. The school moment had already named him in public. The note under my door proved visibility has a price. If I kept drifting in half-truths, my son would pay. So I stopped being a passenger. I set my conditions the way I set my budget. Plain, exact, and non-negotiable. Caleb could not make decisions about Owen without my consent. Not school, not medical, not gifts with strings. No violence done for me without my knowledge. If he crossed that line, I would leave, and I needed an exit plan I controlled, with my own keys, my own money, my own choice. Not witness protection, not captivity disguised as safety. I kept my job path. I kept my last name. I kept a separate account. Help would not become ownership. And he had to tell me the truth moving forward. No more half-truth protection. If we were going to be anything like a family, then family meant I got to see the whole shape of the danger, not just the pieces he thought I could handle. Saying it made my hands shake. Not because I was weak, but because I was finally naming what I deserved. Caleb accepted my boundaries through action. He didn't touch school forms without me. He kept his name off places it didn't belong, and he did it through official channels, the boring way, the way that leaves receipts. He treated my rules like they were part of the plan, not an insult to his pride. Then he neutralized the threat without a bloodbath. The developer didn't get dragged into an alley. He got cornered by exposure. A contract review turned into a financial freeze. A partner got nervous. A board got cautious. The clean shirt started to stain. The pressure around our door disappeared the same way it arrived, quietly. Only this time the silence felt earned. I should have felt pure relief. Instead, I felt gratitude braided with dread, because I had watched power used smoothly, and smooth power can protect you and trap you with the same hand. What saved me, weirdly, was Owen. He stayed a 6-year-old boy even with grown-up danger circling us. He still asked for cocoa. He still left crayons on the table. One evening, I saw Caleb crouched beside our wobbly chair, tightening a loose screw with a cheap screwdriver I'd borrowed from Mrs. Liu. Owen hovered close, offering help with the seriousness only a child can manage. Caleb made it ordinary. He made it routine. There was no claim, no performance, just steady attention that showed up again the next day. My heart broke and mended at the same time, because I could finally explain one thing to my son without lying. This man was choosing us daily. On the morning the danger truly lifted, I felt it in my body first. My phone stayed quiet. The hallway sounded normal. School pickup felt messy and alive instead of watched. I exhaled without counting seconds. That night, in the same cramped kitchen where fear used to echo, Owen taped a hand-drawn star to the window. The points were uneven. The tape was cheap, but it caught the streetlight and turned it warm. Love isn't the opposite of fear. Love is what you build after fear, with boundaries, with truth, and with choices you make on purpose. I'm still cautious. Caleb is still morally complicated, but I'm not erased anymore. And neither is my son. If this story hit you, like the video, share it with someone who needs it, and comment what family on purpose means to you.